Thank you very much, Anna, and I hope you can hear me okay. Just do signal if there's any problems with the volume. So I'm coming to you today from Melbourne in Australia, and today I'll be discussing findings from an international study conducted by the Global Healthy and Sustainable City Indicators Collaboration, which focused on measuring policy indicators for healthy and sustainable cities. And I do want to acknowledge all of the co-authors of this presentation shown on the slide. And I especially want to acknowledge Deepti Adlakar, who co-led the study, and also my co-authors, Carl Higgs, who is presenting a paper after this in this session, and also Billy Giles Corti, who presented a keynote address at the conference yesterday. Excuse me. So the study I'll be talking about today has been recently published as part of a Lancet Global Health series on urban design, transport and health. And so I've included the link there so you can find full details of the study in this paper. So with the majority of people globally now living in urban areas, it is vital that we plan cities that support human and planetary health. We know that urban design and transport features can have detrimental health impacts, including by contributing to things like air pollution, road trauma, physical inactivity, social isolation, and climate change. City planning policies have the power to shape land uses and travel patterns, which in turn affect urban lifestyles, environmental exposures, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So city planning decisions are therefore really crucial for health and attainment of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But we find that many existing indicator frameworks for cities, including the SDG indicators, they tend to focus on downstream health outcomes rather than assessing the quality of policies upstream. So to enable international comparison between cities and to guide city planning, we need to comprehensively assess city-level planning policies using a health lens. So to promote health, policies should be aligned with evidence on health enhancing city planning. They also need to have those clear and specific actions linked to measurable and budgeted policy targets. And this is where policy indicators can be useful for tracking and monitoring the quality of city planning policies. So this study involved assessing city planning policies for 25 cities internationally. So there was 19 cities in high income countries and 6 cities in middle income countries. And we asked the fundamental question, do policy frameworks support creation of healthy and sustainable cities? In order to assess cities internationally, we established the Global Healthy and Sustainable City Indicators Collaboration. And a leadership group of the collaboration recruited built environment and health scholars, as well as policymakers, to participate via the International Physical Activity and the Environment Network, as well as conference presentations. And this resulted in our convenient sample of the 25 cities shown here on this slide, really based on where collaborators were located. The local collaborators collected the policy data, which we then analysed centrally to assess and compare the availability and quality of policies across the 25 cities. And we did focus on assessing policies for the whole city or the majority of the metropolitan area, and included formal, publicly available government policy documents. So for our policy analysis study, we developed measures for 9 indicators that were originally proposed in the 2016 Lancet series on urban design, transport and health. So our follow-up study was really a proof of concept to see if we could measure and apply those indicators from the 2016 series across diverse cities internationally. And the indicators assessed policies related to a whole range of things. So integrated transport and land use planning, air pollution controls, destination access via public transport, distribution of employment, demand management, particularly car parking restrictions, design, including street connectivity, public open space, access and pedestrian and cycling infrastructure provision and mode share, housing density to support walkability, distance to public transport, and transport infrastructure investment by mode. So in terms of results now, policy frameworks varied substantially across the 25 cities in our study in terms of overall scores for both policy presence and policy quality. So you can see here on this slide a selection of cities highlighting those diverse scores. So it was Belfast that had a perfect score of 24 for policy coverage across the indicator categories, followed by Valencia and then Unst and Melbourne. For policy quality, again, Valencia and Belfast, as well as Graz, had relatively high scores in terms of being specific, measurable and consistent with evidence on planning healthy cities. We found that Baltimore in the US had a much lower policy quality score than many other cities in high-income countries. Cities in middle-income countries tended to have the largest policy gaps and lower policy quality scores compared to the high-income countries. Sao Paulo in Brazil was an outlier among cities in middle-income countries with a policy framework that in fact outperformed many cities in high-income countries, making it a real leading light for other low and middle-income countries. And the spatial indicator work that Carl Higgs will be discussing next actually showed that Sao Paulo's policy strengths may be contributing to better outcomes on the ground compared with other cities in middle-income countries. We found that there are significant gaps in policy that need to be addressed, with an absence of key policies being a potential barrier to that integrated planning across the full suite of transport and urban design features that we need for healthy and sustainable cities. So many cities did not have policies important for health and sustainability. We see that, here on this slide, that many cities lacked policies for health impact assessment requirements, street connectivity, and information on investment in active and public transport. And in terms of policy quality, many cities did not have enough specific and measurable policies to support general aspirations for health and sustainability. So we saw lots of general goals supporting healthy, livable, sustainable cities, but not those measurable targets to back that up. So see here on this slide, the percentage of cities with the measurable targets for selected measures in our study. And we found that too many policies were those general aims without targets to guide implementation and help hold governments accountable. Cities in middle-income countries generally had fewer specific and measurable policies compared to those in high-income countries. So to give some examples now of the type of evidence consistent, specific and measurable policy targets that we need, we see here that Mexico City, for example, has a public open space requirement of a minimum of 12 square metres of public open space per inhabitant, and you can see how measurable and specific that is. And Auckland has a public transport access target of 95% of the population being within 500 metres of a public transport stop in 2021. So some cities had policies that did not align with the evidence on health promoting cities. And this is a real problem because policies that are not aligned with evidence, they set up barriers to creating healthy, sustainable cities, particularly when actual policy targets are inconsistent with evidence, because that locks cities into unhealthy and unsustainable urban systems. So examples of cities with policy targets that were inconsistent with evidence are listed here on this slide. US and Australasian cities tended to be worst in this regard. For example, we found 3 policy targets were inconsistent with evidence in Baltimore and Seattle, and Baltimore and Adelaide, and 2 in Seattle. And unambitious active transport and urban design targets, and then targets that actually actively support car use, they undermine efforts to increase physical activity, improve air quality, and reduce carbon emissions. So our study really showed that it's feasible to systematically assess evidence-informed policy indicators for diverse cities internationally. Our study really underlines the need to strengthen city planning policies and legislation, and that policy indicators can be really useful for that endeavour by helping to benchmark and monitor progress towards healthy and sustainable cities. To transform our cities for the better, we identified specific policy gaps and limitations that should be remedied in each city, as well as policy strengths that should be maintained over the long term. Comparisons between cities could help civil society to advocate for reform and give policymakers the evidence that they need to target policy gaps. There is an urgent need to build policy capacity for health enhancing city planning in lower resource settings, low and middle income countries. So this is a key role of governments in higher resource settings and also multilateral organisations. Low and middle income countries could look to the example of cities such as Sao Paulo, which has relatively high quality policy. We encourage more widespread application of indicators to inform decision making, including in the most rapidly growing low and middle income country cities. So overall, we found that there is a need for more specific and measurable policy targets to support general aspirations for healthy and sustainable cities. And policies need to be informed by evidence on how to plan healthy cities, including aligning policy targets with evidence on the optimal thresholds for urban design and transport features. And just to finish, to disseminate the findings and help inform city planning, we've developed this global observatory of healthy and sustainable cities. The global observatory includes scorecards and reports for the 25 cities, as well as open access tools. So we encourage you to have a look at this, and the web address is there, healthysustainablecities.org. Do not know what has happened to my slides there. My apologies. So the reports on the observatory include policy checklists that could inform changes needed for local policies. So these checklists include overall city planning requirements, walkability, which is shown here on the slide using the example of Baltimore, public transport access, as well as a checklist for public open space access. And in addition to the reports, we provide these single page scorecards, so that really an infographic that summarises the key results, including policy indicators for each city at the bottom there. And so just lastly, I want to acknowledge all of the members of the Global Healthy and Sustainable City Indicators team who have contributed and co-authored this policy analysis study. Thanks very much. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for this very, I would say, thorough and really rich information. You have done a lot of work, as you have shown, consolidating all these policy-related areas and identifying the gaps that might be there. So thanks for that. I now have open the floor for questions. If anybody has a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. We can then ask you to open your mic and pose the question. Does anybody have any questions? While you think about that, we already have a question on the chat. I would like to pose that to Melanie. This comes from Irene Egino. Irene is asking actually something quite interesting, which is related to the theme of our conference, which is futures. So this question to Melanie from Irene is, since we are in the Futures Conference, apart from focusing on healthier cities, which is a must, do you think that the city paradigm, quote, unquote, itself should be questioned?
Yes, I think, Irene, you're getting to the fact that, we are really in the urban age at the moment. We're for the first time, a majority of the world's population live in cities, and that's a trend that is certainly expected to continue. So we'll have more and more people living in urban contexts and urban environments. So this really does create an urban or a city's paradigm for the world. I feel like probably the research that I'm engaged in takes that paradigm as a long-term trend that we are witnessing, and then just tries to maximise the benefits for population health within that system. So, I'm no expert on how we sort of reverse urbanisation, but given that we are an urban world now, the majority of people live in cities. Therefore, they're a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen during COVID-19 that they are a driver of infectious disease spread when we have a pandemic. So, given all of these things, we just need to make sure that we plan our cities for the future so that they best protect and promote population health. And that's where city planning decisions are a really important part of that. It is interesting that, you know, we have seen some city to regional migration in a country such as Australia due to COVID-19 lockdown restrictions. You know, whether these trends continue or are maintained will be interesting, and how far spread they are across the world will be very interesting to watch. And we shouldn't forget, I think, that not everyone lives in our major cities, our big cities, that you know, we have larger regional centres as well as smaller urban environments that are also really important human contexts that we need to ensure that we're promoting the health of those, you know, less dense environments as well.
Very good. Melanie, did you finish, or is your mic muted? Yeah, okay. Very good. Are there any other questions coming from the audience at this point? If not, we have a few more minutes. I wanted to ask Melanie a question. In terms of identifying kind of or questioning what is the paradigm shift that we are observing. You have a very comprehensive analysis of policies that you have done in your project, and it will be interesting to see what are the relations, the interconnections between policies. You have, of course, done that very in depth, and you have already identified the gaps, but it also would be interesting to see maybe some connections, some patterns that might emerge from this very, very comprehensive map that you have built. My question to you is simply, when you show that you have, when you show your policy framework score for quality, I was wondering, how do you measure the quality of these policy scores in the different cities that you study?
So policy quality, you know, there's a whole range of different characteristics that make for good quality policy. And, you know, for example, in community and stakeholder engagement is a really important part of policy development implementation. This is an aspect which we didn't look at. But what we did focus on is some criteria based on what we know is good policy. And that is that you have specific policy rather than general aspirational statements, and that you have measurable policy, so that there are targets or you know, key standards that you are working towards, rather than just saying, you know, we want to create healthy cities, but how? You know, how exactly? Is there a specific population-based goal that governments can actually work towards and track and monitor their progress over time? So that was one key aspect that we measured with quality. And then the other is that the policies themselves and the targets that were included, that they are actually consistent with evidence. There's been a growing evidence base over the last 20, 25 years that it, you know, really does establish connections between features of the built environment, urban design and transport features, and health outcomes. So we have the evidence there, and we assessed where the policies actually align with that evidence base. There's still more work to do to establish the evidence-based thresholds required for some urban design and transport features. So we begun that process in this series by looking at evidence-based thresholds and developing those for certain characteristics like population density, street connectivity, and public transport access. But there is more work to do there to support policymakers and guide decision making. So yeah, we looked at those particular characteristics, and then we developed a scoring system so that we could then summarise those findings and say, you know, this is how cities compared on those quality characteristics. And that's a nice segue also to Carl, who will be talking next, because obviously we assessed the presence and quality of policy, but really important also is how policy is delivering on the ground. And so that's why we had a complementary study, which Carl will talk about, that looked at the spatial delivery of those built environment features on the ground.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. Very good. We have one more question that came on chat, but maybe briefly, I could say we have less than a minute for this. It comes from Prakash Bakade. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce your name correctly. I try my best. He is asking, have you considered the connectedness, of policy and response from the urban citizen?
Sorry, just to clarify, so the interconnectedness between policy and citizen science, was that right?
More or less, yes. Between interconnectedness of policy and response from the urban citizen, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, fundamentally, it's really important, and there's strong evidence in the sort of policy literature that it's really important that you have citizen and civil society engagement in policy development as well as implementation. So you know, that is a really important aspect of the quality of policy delivery for cities, to make sure that they are meeting community needs and also getting stakeholder and community buy-in to the delivery of changes in the built environment, so that, you know, the community and civil society are coming along with adjustments as we move from perhaps car-centric transport to more active transport, for example. But our study didn't specifically look at that aspect, but the reason why we've developed this global observatory of healthy and sustainable cities is to provide resources so that they're publicly available, and stakeholders, community members, advocates can access our scorecards and reports on their city and use those as a tool to advocate for policy reform and to get engaged with policymaking processes. And we're seeing really great, you know, uptake and engagement with the observatory. So we're tracking that over time to see what impact the observatory has, but, you know, really promising signs that there is engagement with that platform.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Melanie, again. And now we give the floor to the second speaker, special indicators of urban design and transport features for achieving healthy and sustainable cities. The floor is yours, Carl.
There's the mute button. Sorry, I lost it there for a second. Hi, my name is Carl Hicks, and like Melanie, I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues in the Global Healthy and Sustainable City Indicators collaboration on our work measuring spatial indicators of urban design and transport features for achieving healthy and sustainable cities. I'm using the phrase urban design and transport features here as shorthand for a list of health supportive interventions for urban contexts which support people to live locally, increase physical activity, and be socially connected. And so this includes things like walkable access to amenities and services like fresh food markets, regularly serviced public transport and large public open space, but also the levels of population densities which support the delivery of these amenities, and pedestrian street network connectivity so people can readily get to them. We looked at the spatial distribution of these aspects and an overall measure of walkability across neighbourhoods of 25 diverse cities across 19 lower middle to high income countries, as you just heard, internationally in our recently published paper included in the Lancet Global Health series on urban design, transport and health, which you can find links to from our website at healthysustainablecities.org. So through this presentation, I'm going to share with you how we developed and used an open source spatial indicator software framework according to an open science ethos, integrating novel global open data sets. And this allowed us to make within and between city comparisons of the delivery of urban features and identify that many people in neighbourhoods and cities worldwide don't have access to the urban design and transport features needed to create healthy and sustainable cities. We hope that our methods can help others to engage with this task to monitor and track our urban environments to support creating healthier, more sustainable cities. And so why does this matter? Touching on the discussion we just had, we know that an increasing majority of people worldwide live in urban settings or cities. And we know that the lived experience of access to amenities and services can vary greatly across the neighbourhoods of a city, at least as much as cities themselves vary according to their geographic, political, and historic contexts. This varying capacity to live locally is reflected at a population level in engagement in physical activity, social connectedness, and the health and well-being benefits that these bring across the course of our lives. For us as individuals, it can determine whether we choose to walk or drive to get to our groceries on the weekend. But more broadly, it shapes how we access employment, education, health services, and opportunities for recreation. And we know that these choices and opportunities have implications not just for individual and population health, but also for our planet. We just heard from my colleague, Melanie Lowe, in her presentation, how policy targets for urban design features which support healthy, sustainable cities are found to varying degrees at local, national, and international levels of government, including in the Sustainable Development Goals, such as Goals 3 and 11 displayed here, relating to healthy and sustainable cities. To be able to monitor whether and where the targets we set are being achieved and plan for action towards this, we need local neighbourhood measures of the spatial distribution of urban design and transport features. So this can be done using spatial indicators, which can then be used to inform tailored urban planning interventions to transform cities and lives. In our study, we endeavoured to approach this in a rigorous and transparent way through a commitment to open science. We identified high quality open data on urban environments with global scope to support fair comparisons across diverse cities, such as the European Commission Global Human Settlements layer for identification of urban areas and high resolution estimates of the population distribution within them. OpenStreetMap for identification of pedestrian traversable road networks, amenities, and public open space. And GTFS transport feeds to identify locations of regularly serviced public transport. We produced an open source software framework so that our work was both transparent and generalizable for use by others to apply to new cities and time points. But importantly, we did this in conjunction with a collaborative network of local and domain experts who were able to provide advice on our data and measures. We checked our work along the way through review of validation reports, including of the preliminary data we collated for urban areas. This helped us to identify instances where coverage of open data was lacking and address this. For example, through collecting a custom-built data set on local amenities for Maiduguri in Nigeria, where we found that OpenStreetMap didn't really represent these adequately. We also conducted feedback surveys on results to ensure that these made sense to domain experts with local knowledge. Our collaboration network also assisted with our semi-automated preparation of customized reports in multiple languages, presenting key findings for each city, providing a final chance to ensure that the results we disseminated weren't only correct, but also accessible for local communities, planners, researchers, and decision makers. Our methods and findings have been published as open access articles, and our outputs have been indexed in public research repositories, as well as linked to from our website, healthysustainableCities.org. So a foundational concept to our study is how we define an urban area. You can see in the satellite imagery on the right that the official administrative boundary from the Australian Bureau of Statistics for Greater Melbourne, where I live and am presenting from today, extends into places that are more rural or at least peri-urban than what you might think of as a city. So while administrative boundaries which are policy relevant and are located for each of our 25, could be located for each of our 25 cities, we knew that these could not be assumed to all be meaningfully urban nor fairly comparable. So we incorporated empirical data from the Global Human Settlements data of the European Commission, which contains a database of urban centres. We defined the urban study regions we were interested in as the intersection of the city administrative boundary and the empirically identified urban area. As an example of our collaborative approach to this, all boundaries were confirmed with local experts and some exceptions were required. For example, the Spanish city of Vic has been around for more than 1,000 years, but it wasn't identified as an urban area in the Global Human Settlements layer. In this case, we used the recommended boundary provided by our collaborators. Returning to Melbourne, Australia, and using a satellite-based map just to display context, we can see how we were able to evaluate the distribution of population using the global human settlements data in a consistent way for each city, using OpenStreetMap to represent pedestrian accessible networks and amenities such as public open space or locations of fresh food markets, and then evaluate that for every 50 meters along the traversable network within urban populated areas, for example, who can access a fresh food market and who can't. So you may or may not know that Melbourne prides itself on its rankings as a highly livable city, and the central city and many parts of the inner suburbs, like where I live in the photo on the right, might live up to that reputation, depending what you think of as being livable. But if we look at the results we found for population access to services and amenities, some of you, particularly from European cities, might be surprised at some of the statistics. We can see that Melbourne has an established transportation network with coverage comparable to most other cities in our international study. Almost more than 90% of residents have access to a stop or station within 500 meters, which is about equivalent to a 5-minute walk. However, this particular metric doesn't consider the connectivity or the service quality of stops. Less than half of Melbourne residents were estimated to have access to public transport stops with a usual daytime weekday service frequency of 20 minutes or better. Some cities in our study had almost all of the urban population living near well-serviced public transport stops, specifically Sao Paulo, Lisbon and Bern had more than 90%. Access to public open space, including large public open space, was better for Melbourne residents than most of the other cities included in the study. But access to fresh food was in the lowest quartile, with fewer than 25% of the population in either within a 500-meter walk of a supermarket or market. We also evaluated the percentage of population living in neighbourhoods meeting minimum thresholds for densities associated with achieving physical activity targets, such as the World Health Organization's goal of a 15% reduction in physical inactivity by achieving at least 150 minutes of total walking per week. This was based on threshold analysis by our colleague Esther Seren and also found in our published series. So returning to our example city of Melbourne, fewer than 20% of the population were estimated to live in neighbourhoods with sufficient population density to achieve these goals for increasing physical activity based on these estimates. And a similar proportion of the population only met the minimum recommended thresholds for street connectivity to achieve that goal. We found that many people in neighbourhoods in Melbourne and other cities worldwide don't have access to the urban design and transport features needed to create healthy and sustainable cities. One way of summarising this is using a walkability index, which is a score for local access to a mix of services and amenities, the population density for supporting those amenities along with social connectedness, and a well-connected street network to access them. If we look at Melbourne look at walkability in Melbourne relative to the other cities studied, we can see that neighbourhoods meeting these criteria were largely concentrated in the city centre and inner suburbs. This sprawling pattern of underserviced, car-dependent urban form was a bit different to patterns of many other cities studied. Let's have a look at them now, ordered in terms of percentage of population living in neighbourhoods with walkability above the study median. Starting with Lisbon, Portugal, for which we estimate almost all of the population live in such a neighbourhood. Sao Paulo, Bern, Hong Kong, Chennai, Barcelona, these cities all scored very high on this metric. Mexico City, Belfast, Ons, Valencia, I'll just scroll through the list, and Köln acknowledge our cities, Bangkok, Maiduguri, Olomouc. By reading out the names, I'm trying to give enough time for you to look at the cities. Ghent, Vic, which I mentioned before. But the cities of the US and Australia, New Zealand, actually stuck out a bit as having this sprawling nature in common. And so you can see that a bit better here. So stepping through the cities with the greatest percentage of population living in the most walkable neighborhoods, we saw that cities of Asia, Europe and Latin America and Maiduguri in Nigeria were towards the top of the list, regardless of the country's gross domestic product. considered in these terms, the cities of the US, New Zealand, and Australia were the least walkable for their resident populations, arguably. There are historic contexts shared in common, which are here, which may explain that pattern. So these are high income countries with settler colonial histories, post-war population booms, development largely unconstrained by geography, with broad adoption of car-dependent urban design practices, which have probably resulted in this sprawling outer suburban growth. But there are limitations to that measure of walkability, which it doesn't consider aesthetics, quality, or even the presence of footpaths, shade, and so on. So these are other indicators that could be, other indicators that consider these aspects could be calculated using our approach, given available data, but we didn't do that in this study. The sample of included cities in our study also wasn't random or large. It was determined by enthusiasm amongst our international network of research collaborators, as Melanie explained. But what we did demonstrate was that we could measure and map policy statistics for urban contexts around the world using open data and provide a framework for doing this and tools. So for neighbourhoods and populations whose needs aren't being met, what can be done about that? Measuring indicators like these is a start, which can support the momentum and growing enthusiasm for urban renewal, supporting local living. This kind of enthusiasm is found in concepts like the 15-minute neighbourhood promoted by C40, or the 20-minute city, which is found in Melbourne's recent planning for 2050. An example of a planned intervention for Melbourne is a suburban rail loop with development of neighbourhood precincts around new railway station community hubs. So this is intended to help fill the gaps in Melbourne's transport network, improve access to services and amenities, provide local employment opportunities, and better enable local living.
Sorry, Carl, you have about a minute and a half to go.
Oh, really? Well, that went quick. So anyway, so spatial indicators can help. Minute and a half. I just need to say things then. I need to say it. The measuring of the indicators can help inform the planning towards those kinds of interventions and monitor them across time to make sure that progress is happening as intended. So I mentioned we did create these resources translated in multiple languages to help maximize the impact and help people advocate for change. But our ambition now is to expand the 25 cities study with a 1,000 cities challenge. So the vision for this global observatory of healthy and sustainable cities is that it'll be used as a tool for surveillance, reporting, goal setting, policy making, practical guidance and advocacy to encourage scaling up of healthy, sustainable urban design and planning efforts, provide data comparability across multiple cities of the world, and to grow to include additional city planning indicators and comparable data for more than 1,000 global cities. So we extend an invitation to those interested in contributing to this effort to reach out to us for future collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. Very interesting. You have sort of zoom into the urban design aspect. I'm pretty sure that Melanie has found some connections there to the work that they have done with policy development and in the same area as well. So we start to sort of connect a little bit the dots here to create a little bit of the story of how all these topics and areas of exploration for better and healthier cities could actually work. If we think about what is the relevance there for futures and for the future of well-being in cities. I want to open the floor now for questions or comments from the audience. Raise your hand or write our comments, any comments or questions in the chat. We will be happy to get them. Anybody wants to raise their hand or pose a question at this point? By the way, we were informed that we have our third presentation has been canceled, the foreclosing and pre-opening futures through citizens' narratives in the urban environment was canceled. So we don't have to anymore the five presentations, but we have one less. So we won't have to end it so late for those who want to have lunch. I have a question for Carl. Carl, and I think this is also related also to Melanie and the previous presentation. I'm trying to think on what are those patterns, and we have at the beginning of your presentation, Carl, you mentioned the scope and being small, medium, large income countries. There are, of course, there is a lot of room for especially when you get to the level of detail that you have got with your urban design kind of research. I think it's interesting to see that there are all these geographies, but when we move from small to middle to large income countries, we must be able to begin to see some relations, some either opposite or some connections there, or some relations. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more from the top of your head? What had been these kind of surprises or new information that you have seen when you connect, for example, very low income countries way of urban design in connection to health versus high income countries in your case?
Yeah, so absolutely there are differences, and I kind of glossed over some of that. Certainly some of those differences relate to the quality and availability of data in the first instance to be able to reliably do this kind of work. And that's why it's really important that you don't just assume that, for example, what is on an OpenStreetMap is the truth. It's what has been contributed by a community who has to be actively contributing, and that needs to be checked. So, for example, we found that the road network was adequate for Maiduguri. It's kind of hard infrastructure that has been coded in, but not the amenities. So we did have to reach out for that. And that kind of ties in with then how you consider other aspects, like a lot of lower income countries often have more informal collective transport networks that take up the role perhaps of some public transport. So for example, in Mexico City and Chennai, Mexico City is a great example. The colectivos, they don't have, there's not really a GTFS feed for these collective transports, but they provide important connections. It's not public transport, but it's cheap transport that people do use and can use to get around. And that's not something we could capture really. GTFS data is really great where you can get it, but it's not available for all cities. So we didn't measure that aspect of frequent service for all cities. In some cities which were apparently lacking, well, to what degree is that taken up by that informal transport is a good question. So that's kind of ties in with the data consideration, but also the just different contexts that are at play in different places. Trying to, I mean, we were surprised though that, like for example, Sao Paulo was in one of our middle income countries that outperformed, well, Melbourne in terms of transport, for example, and probably provided a good, I think in our paper we suggested Sao Paulo is a good exemplar in terms, particularly in terms of public transport for middle income cities for what can be achieved. Middle income cities in middle income countries. I'm probably rambling now, but I don't know if I've addressed a bit of what you were asking there.
Yeah, I think it's one interesting observation when we talk about high income countries versus low income or medium income, when we try to put the income element there, economic the economic value or variable, I think we could also start to see that it doesn't equal, high income countries doesn't necessarily equal more mobility or better mobility. It's just different mobility, but it's interesting just to see to what extent maybe those so-called low-income countries have better mobility in terms of walkability and other means of transport, when you could have countries like the USA and cities where it's just impossible to walk because you don't even have sidewalks. It's a car-driven city. You're just by design, they are built as, or Dubai, they are built for driving, not for walking. So.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And you did just remind me that another aspect that we didn't really look at, but what we were aware of as an issue is hyperdensity. While broadly population density does support, it provides a population base to provide the services and amenities people need for local living. You need certain levels of density to provide that. That particularly in some of the middle-income countries, there are levels of hyperdensity that maybe are not so conducive to health and well-being. Like, it's possible that things can be too dense, and we didn't specifically look at that in our study. We didn't have enough examples or samples. So it was in Esther Seren's paper I mentioned, she touches on this topic, but we didn't have the sample to look at the thresholds of population density that could impact people's engagement in physical activity. But there's a hypothesis that, well, there's probably a ceiling. But in general, particularly for cities like Melbourne, we're nowhere near that ceiling. We don't need to worry about it in Melbourne. It's, yeah, anyway.
Very good. Thank you again. If there are no any more questions from the audience, then I will ask that we go to the next presenter. I welcome Prakash Vakade, an interconnectedness of land and land use planning and the environment, policy options for planetary futures. Prakash, the floor is yours. Prakash, are you there? Or not? Maybe he's not there as of yet. Do we have the presenter of presentation 4, or do we have the next presenter in our group?
Hi, Anna. I think that's us.
Okay, very good. Then go ahead, Heidi. You will then present something on foresight to power, from foresight to power, remaining pathways of land use and water governance futures. Go ahead, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Hold on. Hold on, I'm just sharing my screen, sorry. Do you see it now?
Yes.
All right. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'll be presenting together with my co-author, Sharman. So we'll be presenting From Foresight to Power, Challenging and Reimagining Futures of Land Use and Water Governance. So just a brief introduction, this project, this paper, we started this in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. So all of the methods we used were conducted online, and yeah, we really planned to have the foresight happening in person with all of the interactions. But yeah, and the questions that inspired us to do this actually were two major questions. First, what might the futures of land use and water governance in the Philippines look like if it were co-created by diverse stakeholders? And second question was, what are the enabling principles and mechanisms that can help steer foresight to power? So this actually is a project funded by the Dutch ministry trying to use foresight and landscape governance to put different stakeholders from different sector together and come up with new landscape arrangement, new policies, new vision for land use and water governance. So that's why we're really focusing on co-creation and multi-stakeholder platform. So the participants of the project came from different islands and areas from the Philippines, mainly from Sierra Madre, which is a northern area of the Philippines, and an isolated island called Palawan, and in the southern part of the country, Bukidnon, Misamis Oriental. We had 24 representatives from local NGOs. So when we say local NGOs, these are NGOs actually working with different communities on the ground, and unfortunately we had less representation from the government, which were only 3 representatives from Sierra Madre, Palawan, and Bukidnon. And for the methods, we use futures triangle, scenario development, and backcasting. Yep, and Sherman will share with us the outcomes of the foresight for water governance.
Oh, yes. But before that, Heidi, let me just quickly at least, discuss a little bit of the process, previous slide. So the process has undergone at least like around 3 phases, which is, of course, revealing what's obvious as far as the future, which is default or used from the perspective of the participants. And then once the obvious or default use future of landscape and water governance is revealed, we facilitated a conversation where they attempted to reframe their assumptions about the future of water and land governance. And then after which we put them into a space wherein everyone reflected and discerned on what are the potential and possible steps that enable the participating organization to achieve the preferred future scenario. So yes, now, of course, through that process, using a variety of foresight tools and methods are the scenarios of the preferred future for water governance and land use. So let me begin with the preferred future for water governance. And here, actually, the image or the story of the future is that by the year 2030, from a once highly vulnerable country, the Philippines was able to pivot its weakness, in terms of water management and sustaining water resources to an enterprising strength, which is of course the preferred future scenario is for the country to export fresh water, particularly in the ASEAN region. But before reaching this state, the country underwent a series of massive policy revision. Which is, of course, refreshing the visions as mandate, as per the mandate of the laws and executive orders and initiatives programs that are currently in place. And essential to that is restructuring the frameworks for water use and supply. As you can see here, these were the drivers of change that was identified by the participants as compelling, as a compelling scaffolding, or structure in the developing the scenarios from politics, nature, technology, and economy. Now, next slide, please, Heidi. just to continue with the narrative, this is a synopsis of the narrative wherein, the Department of Water Management in the Philippines, which is a newly created ministry in this scenario by the Philippine government, is that there is a certain Secretary Hilario of the Philippine Water Department reports that the Philippines is now the world's prime water exporter. So the Philippines established a strong, cohesive legal and regulatory framework in 2030 that is focused on implementing a countrywide decentralized watershed system. But of course, just to put in more context into this, is driven by a strong clamor, from the different sectors, pushing the government, to improve, to refocus and improve its strategy in respecting, of course, the rights of water consumers and water or human rights, particularly, the responsibilities and the power, given to the LGUs in terms, or local government units in terms of governing, ensuring distributive access as far as water is concerned. And what particularly struck me in this scenario, which of course has also undergone a process wherein we place the participants to imagine a day in the life of a person in a scenario wherein the Philippines becomes a water exporter, not just in the context of enterprise or market, but rather an 8-year-old a child who is aware of where their sources of water supply come from, and how responsible they become for conserving water. So water literacy would emerge as a major component in improving the state of water futures in the country. And last but not the least, of course, is some structures that were implemented in the process that includes, among others, small-scale and multi-purpose water harvester systems. So as you can see here, these are some of the really, I would say, compelling policies, strategies, and programs, initiatives that they were able to identify to achieve the preferred future scenario using the backcasting methodology. Heidi?
And now we go to the next scenario. So we did the same methods basically also for land use. And you will see some similarities and I guess some overarching themes for policy work. So for land use, the outcome scenario was that in 2070, the Philippines will be celebrating the golden year of regenerative land care. And a quick context, the conversations that happened during the foresight process, it happened in a time where there were a lot of policies being pushed for forest conservation, for forest management, anti-mining, and all the sustainable policies being pushed for by different NGOs. And yet the political arena does not recognize, still doesn't support these kinds of policies. So the conversations took place in this time and place. And what's interesting is that also during the conversation, it came out that the major drivers of change for land use in the country would be, of course, politics. Who makes the decisions, for what and for whom? And are indigenous communities actually considered for these policies and economics and culture? And I think during the first day of the plenary, we've been talking about how do we move from quantitatively valuing environment and actually taking into consideration culture and different indigenous practices in foresight and in the futures. And lastly, also taking into consideration how can the Philippines actually ride on new technologies for land use. And the narrative that came about was that there are three major themes for the narrative. First is the use of artificial intelligence technology to help farmers, to help local farmers. Second is the use of central database for actual land use and just basically identifying where the crops are and how to zonate these different areas. Because one of the major challenges in the Philippines is either over or underestimating crop areas because of the different methodologies used. There's remote sensing, but then The government is still keen to support the traditional counting of hectares. And at the end, there's a lot of problem going on how many hectares actually are dedicated to rice and other crops. And the last strong emerging theme was the management of ancestral domains by indigenous people. Because more than a quarter of Philippines is actually ancestral domains. However, the indigenous peoples are not empowered capacity-wise, finance-wise, and policy-wise to actually govern the domains granted to them. So looking forward to 2070, we see a Philippines where technology supports farmers and indigenous communities to take care of their land, and also supported by policy and actual digital platforms to support and protect these people. And at the same time, ancestral domains being recognized by the government and also by uh, I think the general public. So in order to create meaningful pathways for land use, the group actually focused on governance, policy, and regulation, because as of now, that's actually the major bottleneck for land use. So policies aren't harmonized. So different sectors, different government agencies have the different mandates over land, and it's just like a chaotic policy arena. And also a lot of interest for research and development, because they really appreciate the value of advancing science to help them make decisions, a value of advancing science in a way that recognizes the knowledge and the practices from farmers, and not just the science that comes from experiments, not just the science that comes from the experts themselves. So it's a more of trying to recognize the role of citizen science, the role of co-creation in science for developing the land use scenario in the Philippines. And I guess one of the most difficult conversations we had was actually to how do we then steer this kind of foresight? How do we then steer these imaginations to power in the future? And during the conversation, there were 4 overarching themes that the group actually identified. First is the value of co-creation. So who gets to say what the future looks like, and who gets to invite, who is invited in these kinds of conversations and negotiations. And there's also a discussion on shared responsibility, like the futures is a space and time where there should be shared responsibility among the government, among the civil society organization, as well as the private sector. And of course, connectedness and co-management. And second, I think the word agility was really commonly used during the time of pandemic. So how do communities, how do government, and how do different sectors actually become agile in a more volatile time and space? So there's like discussion on patience, grit, and adaptability in terms of policy, in terms of imaginaries, and also critical thinking, which involves creativity, imagination, and redefining landscapes. I think this is something that really struck me during the conversation, that even if we're talking to community people, they actually want to embrace science. They want to embrace technology, but the kinds of sciences and the kind of technology that also enables them, that they understand, that resonates with their culture. And I think that really entails a lot of creativity on both ends, from the scientists and from the researchers and from communities, how to come about with this kind of technologies. And last, of course, and not the least, sustainability. What kinds of policies, what kind of practices are we supporting? Are these practices supporting the integrity of the landscape? Are we promoting conservation? Are we promoting restoration, resilience, adaptability, and a sense of balance? So yeah, at the end of the conversation, the question was, how can we then steer foresight to power, and really banking on these 4 elements: co-creation, agility, critical thinking, and sustainability.
Yes, and just one quick note, Heidi, is that, of course, from the perspective of the participants, they did acknowledge that these preferred features are not conflict-free, but they are always value-laden. And each participant was struck with a personal question of, the idea of empowerment to emancipation. Definitely all of these preferred futures, together with the strategies identified, could definitely create some sort of polarization as far as interests are concerned. But then what is important is that the future in the context of truth or preference is speaking to power. So that I would say was really, the tensions and the dynamics. But then, of course, at the end of the day, they believe that there is actually hope in flipping, the default, transforming the default and use future, which they see as some sort of disowned if it occurs in 2030, and achieve transformation in water and landscape governance.
Thank you very much, Heidi and Sherman, for this work. Wow, what an incredible set of tools that you use there for study this and bring out this aspect of water and resilience in the water systems there in the Philippines. I would like to, before I ask any questions, I would like to open up the floor for those who want to post any questions to Heidi and Sherman. Please go ahead, raise your hand or open the mic and ask or comment in the chat as well, if you wish. While the others are,
I think Melanie has hand up. I'm saying I think Melanie has raised her hand.
Melanie has a raised hand, so
Yeah.
I think you can go ahead, Melanie.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. I was just curious for you to elaborate a bit more on how the foresight process that you used in particular has the potential, if successful, to build that resilience into the system. So yeah, I know you mentioned that on your last slide there, but just if you could elaborate on that a bit more.
Yes, it's a variety of tools and methods that we use, and it was designed in a way that enables people to actually have a conversation of imagining alternative and preferred futures and finding pathways to achieve them. But of course, in the process of these conversations, a lot of reflections has emerged, in this conversation, and they started to question about, their capacities, capability, at the level of commitment, and the values are required to actually, do this, and in the context of a long-term strategy, and they started to wonder, really what kind of capacities and capabilities do we need to have, not just in the context of strategy, because they know what the strategies were, and they were able to generate several options and strategies, but then it goes into the context of, okay, how might I be able to link the long-term strategy to my more Monday morning reflections, that perhaps inspires me to do this, considering the fact that there are risks involved, not just at a personal, organizational, or government level. But in terms of resilience, of course, the process was curative in this sense that what would resilience look like, or what would resilience mean in the context of the preferred future that was imagined? Is it just technical? Is it narrative? What's the core story here?
Yeah, thank you very much, Melanie, for your question, and Sherman for answering that. We have another question here by Vilma. She is asking, I would like to know how to bring together community views with government policy to achieve a better future. How will you manage this?
I can answer to that, Sherman. Yeah, so the Who Foresight process is actually embedded in a larger project that's focusing on inclusivity and landscape governance. So the Foresight is just one of the many aspects of the project, but I would say bringing together community views with government policy, at least for the context of this project, entailed us at least 2 years of continuous dialogues where we open tables for conversations for both government people and for community to actually talk about what matters to them in the aspect of land use and water governance. I think we held at least 3 dialogues for these sectors every year to ensure that the conversations are going on and to ensure that trust is built and the continuity of interest and the continuity of trust over time is built. And in terms of managing this, there has to be, at least for our case, there has to be a bridging organization, in which case there was another local NGO called Forest Foundation who actually bridged the conversations. So there was that NGO tried to be neutral in the sense to bridge these different sectors together. So yeah, I would say it takes time, and I would say also opening a lot of dialogues between different sectors, because we started thinking we want the same things, right? For the future, we would want a bright future, we would want nice future. But in the conversations, you would really see the differences in the futures that we envision, and that takes time to negotiate and to talk about. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Heidi, very much. I think there are some other questions popping up here. Meanwhile, I do want to ask to Heidi and Sherman, in your foresight process here, you touch on, of course, a very critical resource for the future, which is water, and we have a lot of thinking to do. What is the future of water and water access, and in the face of climate change, in the face of planetary emergencies that we are facing. But in terms of your foresight exercise, I was interested whether when you were elaborating on the scenarios and the thinking process, whether inside this topic of water, whether you had something emerged out of your work, in terms of something unexpected, surprising, about what would the future of these decentralized systems would be. How do you think this process opens other futures or other ideas for the future? Or you think this is, you did your backcasting, you did your scenarios, and we come to this point, but this could be sort of the beginning of many other possibilities. So I'm interested in what do you think this process has opened up for this very important topic of water as such?
Yeah, just quickly, several insights are really like, stuck, as far as I'm concerned, was the conversation around it, or perhaps the emergence of an idea of a human conscious, indigenous, conscious artificial intelligence systems. That is, of course, driven by biospheric drivers of change surrounding, the geography, or perhaps the conversation that, enables them to develop or imagine, management systems that enable them to process data and incorporate these things. And another thing was that when foresight is done or the perspective on a non-governmental organization, community empowerment is critical, and I think it could be, I wouldn't say the game changer, but an important push to drive visioning as a power to build alliance and influence policy processes and decision making. So I think those are the things. Yep. If ID wants to add something, yep.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that. The process actually opened the different sectors to appreciate the different values where they're coming from. So I would just talk about different functions of water. Like for most communities, they would have domestic uses for water, for irrigation. But for the government, they would have different views and values attached to water. And I think the foresight and the different methods allowed us to think of water not just uh, as a uni how would I say, a unifunctional resource, but looking at water in different functions for the future, and not just benefiting from water, but also how can they actually contribute to conserving future in the water. And I was actually surprised that they envisioned to be a water exporter in 2030 when we're dealing with a lot of water quality and quantity issues in the Philippines. But that speaks a lot about what they think about the positionality of the country in terms of water. So yeah.
Yes, indeed. I think this is precisely why these exercises are so crucial, and how foresight could really open up and support these type of processes, which are not quite open to the public as such. A lot of these decisions are made away from any intervention or participation from the general public. So I think this is precisely what this could do in terms of making the process a little bit more inclusive, more participatory, and even more creative and ingenious in a sense, because when we have more people participating in the process, then better ideas or better conceptualizations of those features could be produced. So thank you very much, Heidi, again, and Shimon for this interesting take. I think we have the possibility for our last speaker. I want to ask Risto, do we have our last speaker online now?
I don't think we have him here, and also I don't have any messages from him, so maybe he's not going to be here in time.
Okay. Well, at this point, the floor is open for any questions. We have a little bit of time if anybody wants to open up their mics, say what they think, what they have learned, what they didn't learn, what they expected, what they take away from this. Feel free to speak up, and we can have a few more minutes of discussion. So the floor is open. In the meantime, I don't know if we still have here, we have Melanie, and Carl could not stay with us. So it's interesting because our session is about interconnections, and these novel interconnections that we could actually, through futures research and future methods, we can attain. So in terms of the health and the social justice and the land use planning interconnections, I think we have been able to sort of put together a very interesting set of topics and a very interesting set of possibilities for how we can increase via features related experiments and foresight methods to really support areas of development that are linked to futures, which is and to link to well-being and health futures, which is land use, or in this case, for most of the sessions has been the urban areas, the cities and the countries and the nations. So I think one takeaway I think is interesting to notice here is that in the way that things are interconnected, more and more we could think of those systems as such, how did they operate, and how futures could be more explicit in every of these processes that take on in terms of land use planning and social and health issues related to people and who lived in these areas. So with that, I don't want to keep everybody any longer because I think some people want to have lunch at this point. If there are no questions from the audience at this point, I want to thank everybody who has participated in this session on behalf of the Finland Futures Research Center. We wish you a very good end of our conference. Thank you very much for participating, and we look forward to the next meeting, the next conference. And yeah, we hope to stay in touch. Thank you very much.